Good evening. Thank you for inviting me out. It's always a pleasure to talk about avocados and meet people that are interested. Yes, I've worked at UC Riverside for over 20 years, and I've been the sort of plant breeder there since around 2005. And so my focus tonight is about the history, prehistory of avocados, and California history, and then some basics on how to grow them. And then some current research that I'm doing. I'm actually hoping to finish my PhD at some point in the next several months. It's close. Thank you. So the topics to cover, I'm going to sort of start off with a bit about grafting and clonal propagation, so you kind of see how they're produced commercially, but also at home potentially. The natural history, what the background of the species, early cultivation, and then California is a major sort of development center of avocados from the 1900s on. And then about the flowering, popular varieties, and I'll give some tips about pruning, fertilizer, irrigation, pest control, and then we'll have a room at the end for questions and answers. So interesting facts about avocado. It's good for you. It's got a lot of potassium, a lot of monounsaturated fatty acids. Actually, that's an area that my research is in the fatty acid composition of avocados. They also have an unusual sugar metabolism, this 7-carbon sugar, which is kind of unique for the species. And so they've been cultivated for quite a while, and the fruit varies in size quite a bit. It's unusual in the sense that a lot of fruits, as they grow, the cells don't divide, they just grow in size, the cells become bigger, but avocados actually, the cells divide as the fruit matures. It's kind of unusual. And it's not just for eating, there's a lot of other uses people have for it. Some people use it in cosmetics because of the oils and the other fatty acids as well. So in the US, US is currently the biggest global consumer of avocados. Most of that's on Super Bowl, actually. If you go to other countries, they don't care about American football, but they know when the Super Bowl is because they plan their avocado harvest based on that date. So you go to Chile, they know when it is. You go to Peru, they know when it is. So most of the American avocados in our markets come from Mexico. That's the biggest producer. California produces quite a bit in the US, but it is globally not a major producer. So when you look at halves, which is 95% of the global market, you see California is basically, if you include the entire region from San Diego up into Paso Robles and San Luis Obispo, you have a pretty long window from January to February to September. But with all the imports coming in from Mexico, Peru, Colombia, Chile, that window has kind of shrunk. And so currently in California, with all the global competition, most of the fruit is harvested in the winter to spring. So that's Hass, which, like I said, is the main global cultivar. So we talked about grafting and clonal propagation in California, and actually throughout the world. Most avocados now are produced on clonal rootstocks. So I don't know, I'm sure some of you are familiar with grafting. Avocado is recently been a graftable plant, so it's still kind of new to that compared to something like apples or grape. But basically, you start with a seedling tree, like in the picture up here, and sort of the initial process is pretty typical. Like this is what people have been doing for about 100 years. You just get a seed and you graft onto it. But when you're producing a clonal rootstock, what you're grafting onto that seed is actually a rootstock, not a Hass, not a Pinkerton, but a rootstock. And so it's an extra step because then you'll take that graft and put it in the dark and let it etiolate for several weeks till it becomes kind of long and pale like that. And then you actually encourage that section to graft. So you end up with a little ball of roots and soil above the seed that sets its own roots. And so that becomes the clonal rootstock. You cut that seed in the bottom, you end up with this little seed mass, little root mass, and you can graft onto that. So it's an extra step. You could just graft onto the seed and have a seedling rootstock, but if you go this little extra step, you end up with a tree that is two parts, and both parts are clonal. So that's it takes quite a while. It's actually a big it's a big time sink and a big cost right now. A clonal rootstock tree is going to cost a grower about $40 to $50 per tree, so that's pretty expensive. It takes about 18 months to 2 years to produce. So that's kind of exciting in some ways. Like there's a lot of work in tissue culture and other techniques that will speed that up. And a lot of people talk about this goal of having like a $10 tree or a $15 tree, which would be pretty nice. So it's almost there. We're getting there. So in talking about avocados, their natural history and early cultivation, it's a member of Riverside, so it's related to cinnamon, bay laurel, California bay tree, sassafras, a lot of other species. And you can, in some avocados, the Mexican one, for example, they actually have aromatic compounds, kind of like an anise or fennel smell, so it shares that with some other laurel, like some of those phytochemicals. It's been cultivated or semi-cultivated for a very long time. So these corn and avocado fragments are actually at the museum in Riverside where my mother works. So she gave me access to take a picture of these. And you can see that although corn has been grown for a very, very long time, avocados have as well. This one here, for example, is radiocarbon dating might be a little off, but it's still very, very long ago, maybe 2,000 years or so. And this is just what people have found. So we know that they've been growing them in Central America, Mexico, and as well in South America for a very long time. So the earliest sort of actual written representation or visual representation of avocados is from the Mayan. Actually, this inscription is from about 500 AD on a tomb, and it represents a sort of goddess that represents the avocado tree or avocado fruit. You can actually see in the picture there's some stylized avocados at the sort of top of her headrest, which is representing the tree. And then these glyphs actually are referred to a location, a town, or an area that was, I guess, where they thought avocados came from, called Tonkin. And so the Mayans as well, they had this system called pet cut, which is where you plant trees that are important to you for either horticultural or medicinal or cultural reasons, and you kind of have like a food forest. And it's the sort of agricultural system that the Mayans practiced throughout their regions, and that's how they moved a lot of these plants around, whether avocado or cacao or other varieties, or other species. So that's probably sort of the earliest type of cultivation of these the species that we see. However, when we think of the current understanding of avocado, it comes from the Aztecs and the Nahua. So the Aztecs in the Codex, Florentine Codex, there is recorded 3 sort of types of avocado. And this is how we think of avocados now. So there was the regular avocado, the avocado. To them, that was the Mexican type avocado, a sort of small, black-skinned fruit. Then there was the sort of, I can't pronounce these names, but the second one we think of as a sort of lowland tropical or West Indian avocado, a larger fruit, a sweeter fruit. And then finally, the Guatemalan type of avocado, which is from the Guatemalan highlands. It's a large fruit with a thick peel. So they recognize these 3 different types of avocados, and that's how we kind of think of the origin of avocados in the present day as well. So we know that for the Mexican type subspecies or ecotype, that it ranges all the way up from Nuevo Leon down to the Central Highlands, and the Guatemalan varieties are from, of course, the Guatemalan Highlands. The only one we're not exactly totally sure about is the sort of lowland tropical ones. Originally, at the time of this, in 1986, the understanding was that they were from the Pacific coast originally, But that was totally based on sort of ethnobotanical knowledge, and there's been a lot of recent speculation and contention that they could have originated just as easily in the Yucatan Peninsula. We don't really know, but the point is that they've been grown for a very long time, and humans as well would move them from one location to another. And so you have this early mixing of a Mexican and a Guatemalan and a sort of more lowland variety that was going on for millennia, basically. So when people in California were interested in trying to introduce the species, they focused on the traits of the ecotypes or species they thought would most suit California. And so in that case, if they focused on Mexican and Guatemalan subspecies because of their cold tolerance. So the understanding was that in the highlands of central Mexico, you might actually get a light frost, and perhaps varieties that were acclimated to that location would do best in California. Guatemalan as well, they have a higher frost tolerance, higher cold tolerance than something in a more tropical area, and so they also focused on those locations. There's been a lot of interest recently with the West Indian or the lowland or tropical subspecies because although they don't have the same cold tolerance that the sort of typical traditional California type Mexican Guatemalan do, they have more salt tolerance. And so there's been a lot of recent interest in these for use for rootstocks or for growing in areas that have more salty water because the Mexican and the Guatemalan are less tolerant. Avocado is a very sensitive root when it comes to chlorides. They don't like salty water. See, they go south pretty quick. So try not to put too many salts on your avocado. But the thing for us to think about tonight as well is the fruit characteristics. So these three different groups also have different kinds of fruit. Like I said earlier, the Mexican fruit tends to be smaller. It has a smooth skin, black skin usually. It's a much earlier fruit. You know, they'll flower in California in the spring. A Mexican fruit could be ready perhaps at the end of summer, much earlier. Guatemalan is later fruit. It hangs in the tree longer. Fruit is larger, has a thick skin. And so the combination of those particular fruit traits are what has resulted in a lot of the California varieties. So speaking of California varieties, prior to the early 1900s, avocado was strictly propagated through seed. So you had people, going out in the forest, finding a tree they liked the fruit from, eating it, and then maybe planting the seed. In the early 1900s in Florida, and then here in California, in Orange, California, the ability to graft trees and then propagate them clonally was discovered. And so from then on, we were able to basically select a tree that we like the fruit or the characteristics of and keep that exact tree going and move it around into different areas. And so, although the early sort of selection that people in California did was based on seed, now they could go and they could actually find graftable clonal material and bring it into California as well. And so they did that, looking not only in Mexico and Guatemala and other places, but throughout the world. So actually, this is an example here where Dr. Fairchild from Florida, the Fairchild Gardens, actually brought this seed up to Charles Taft in Orange. This seed was from Santiago, Chile, but you can see in looking at the fruit that it has a typical sort of Mexican smooth skin, black fruit. And so they were bringing material from all over the world into California to try to develop stuff that would do well here. So when it comes to California's sort of records of introduction, the earliest that we've been able to find is 1856. Dr. Thomas J. White had a tree that was recorded in San Gabriel, but that's the only thing we've heard of from him. So there was a record of the tree that he was growing from the seed and nothing more. So we assume that it probably did not do so well. He did bring it up from Nicaragua, so it was probably one of those more tropical, lowland West Indian types, and did not survive or thrive. So really the first successful introduction was 1870, 1871. Up in Santa Barbara, Judge Ord, he had family in Mexico and understood the different climates better, and he selected an area that had a climate he thought was closer to California, brought seed up, and those trees survived. In fact, a lot of people later in the 1890s and 1900s went into Santa Barbara and saw those trees. This is a picture here taken of one from around 1900, and that inspired them to really focus on avocado. So that was a big kickstart. You had other people as well. Juan Murrieta here was someone that started contacting his contacts down in Mexico. And actually we have a variety in our collection called Murrieta Green that actually is one of his selections from seedling that he collected back in the late 1800s. So it's kind of, he's another sort of early founder. And then another person as well that didn't just focus on avocados, but also other subtropical and tropical fruits is Francesco Franceschi. So actually, he was kind of a documentarian, like this picture of the Ord tree was taken by him, and there's a picture of him over there around 1913. He's actually standing next to a feijoa at that point. I think that's another sort of species that he brought into California. So you had a lot of these people that were interested in trying to develop the California avocado cultivation. So the timeline sort of is, like you see, people brought seed up in the late 1800s, but then with the ability to graft in the 19-teens, 1911, 1914, 1919, you had plant explorers going down into Mexico, like Jalisco, Pueblo, Mexico City, areas around there, and then also into Guatemala, and bringing up actual graftable cuttings, so material to graft. So that is the source of the Fuerte, which many of you probably know as a classic backyard variety, very good fruit. Puebla is another one. I was talking with someone about tonight that came up in 1911 from Jalisco. And then a lot of Guatemalan varieties as well in 1914, like the Queen, the Nabal in 1919, the Nimlio, and these became established California varieties from Guatemala and from Mexico, but then they also produced seed that generated many of the varieties we know today. And there was other locations that people sourced from as well. You know, there's some varieties came in from Hawaii, the Philippines, but just kind of everywhere that people were bringing stuff in. So what happened is in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, you start to see this explosion of variety in California. It seemed like every grower had their own variety that was their own favorite. And the industry actually had issues with this because they didn't know how to handle all these different kinds of fruit. They called them cats and dogs and things like that. And so it was totally different than the market today where everything is halves. Back here, there was many different competing varieties. One of the ones that did develop out of that and became a major component of the market, of course, was Fuerte, however. But even then, when you look at Fuerte, it still was probably, it was not 95% like hash was. So you had a lot of different varieties back then. And at this time as well, like people were starting to notice that as they were growing Fuerte and different varieties, that sometimes they behaved differently in different environments. And that also it seemed that there was some genetic mutations were accumulating, and you had different types of Fuerte in different areas. We're actually seeing that now with Hass as well, but I'll get into that a little later. But so the outcome of this basically is that when you talk about the California population, you know, we have this understanding of the sort of three discrete groups, the Mexican, Guatemalan, and a more tropical variety or subspecies. And they were brought into California in differing ratios with a big focus on the Guatemalan. And so actually, if you look at California's population structure, you can think of California varieties as kind of being their own sort of group, a fourth group, if you're looking at how they sort of fit into things. But nonetheless, although California, you know, forms its own sort of population, its own group, it clusters within the Guatemalan group more than it does the Mexican. So Hass, for example, was a variety that, people thought of as being, maybe 50-50 Guatemalan and Mexican, or 2/3 Guatemalan and Mexican, like a back cross. But in all honesty, it probably is more close to maybe 75 or 80% Guatemalan and less of that than Mexican. So it's just, this is the way the California population structure was built. I think a lot of it was probably from people who are interested in the larger fruit from Guatemalan types, and so that was an early focus. So this legacy, though, you still see this. And so actually, like this picture up here, this fruit from Oakland, my professor, Mary Lou Arpaia, they discovered this up in a backyard in Oakland. This other tree here was in, I think this was West Hollywood a couple of years ago. And this tree here, this guy, he bought the property about 10 years before that, but the tree was enormous, probably from the 1930s, but we don't really know if it's a named variety or if it's just a seedling, because there were so many varieties, but what we have currently in our collection just doesn't match some of these, So avocado, it's a tricky plant. It's tricky to work with on a breeding perspective, but also from production, it's got this unusual flowering type, this flowering system where the flowers open twice, and they open first as female, then they close and they open again as male. And so this is sort of to increase the chance that they're going to cross with another tree instead of fertilizing themselves. So it increases outcrossing. And so the way that we think of them in California is that there's sort of two flower types, A and B. And I actually like this illustration from Norm Alistern's book, because it really demonstrates that it's not that they're two totally opposite flower types. It's just that they kind of operate on different scales. So as you can see, an A flower type, which is like a Hass or a Landhass, or sort of these more like a reed, these kind of common backyard varieties, they are A flower types. They open in the morning of one day, they close, and then way later, the second day, in the afternoon, they open as male. And a B flower type is different. It's ready to go. It opens as a female in the afternoon, closes next day, opens as male. So it's just a faster kind of system. So the idea is that if you plant a mix of A and B, you should get one that's female when the other is male, and that would increase the fruit set. It's not a perfect condition. Sometimes some varieties, more than others, or under some conditions, I think perhaps a sort of more mild coastal condition, you can get a tree that will have both male and female flowers at the same time. And perhaps there's a 2 to 3 hour overlap within the tree so that it can set its own fruit. It's possible. So, a commercial producer is going to want perhaps to plant a mix of A and B. But with backyard growers, I often tell them it's probably okay, unless you live somewhere really hot and really extreme, that you can just plant the trees you want to have fruit when it's ready. So it's not so important to have A and B for a backyard person. But this is still something that we're looking at a lot. We have a new student actually that's going to work on this spring. So the avocado flower as well, it's not a very efficient system of fruiting. You see the tree here, all the yellow on that, those are flowers. You have millions of flowers. And of those millions of flowers, you maybe only get a couple hundred fruit. So the tree itself acts like a giant inflorescence to attract insects in, to pollinize it. And so it makes a challenge as well for breeding, because if you're trying to do an intentional cross, you can't just go to a flower with a paintbrush and get pollen and move it to another one and then bag them up and then wait and see. Because the chances are that flower you pollinize is going to drop. And so there was actually someone in the 1950s, I think it was Hodgson out of UCLA, who did 10,000 hand crosses, and they resulted in 24 fruit, and only 8 of those made it all the way to being mature and having viable seed. So it's just not something that you can do by hand. It makes it a challenge working with this particular species. So in talking about the California varieties, these are sort of the ones that most people know. You've got the Fuerte there, which was the sort of early big variety in California. You have the Bacon and Zutano, and those are those bee flower types that people tend to grow more for pollinizing the A flower types. They are also, those particular varieties are probably some of the more cold hardy of these particular selections. You have Pinkerton, it's another A flower type, it's kind of a green hass-like fruit. Reed is another one. The reed is actually an A flower type from Carlsbad that is a direct seedling of the Nabal, which was brought up from Guatemala, so that's one generation from Guatemala. And then you have these California varieties as well, the Gem and the Langhast, which were released from our UCR program. So again, these are sort of the flower types here. You know, most of the popular varieties, sign varieties, are A flower types. But there are some Bs as well. Like I said, the Bacon, Zutano. Charwell is actually a really good eating fruit. That's a bee flower type as well. Surprise is another UC release. So we talk about the sort of global industry though. It's been dominated by two varieties. The Fuerte, 1920s, 1970s. This is the first big global variety and California variety. It's a large tree. They noticed it had a tendency to alternate there. Avocados tend to have a heavy year and a light year. Fuerte did that quite a bit. Nonetheless, it's a very good tasting fruit. It's stored well, it's shipped well. And they brought it up, so these pictures are from the trip in 1911, where Pocono went down to Atlisco, Mexico, and he collected budwood from this tree, from Alejandro LeBlanc's patio. And the interesting thing, if you think about it, he collected this in 1911. You see the size of that tree. It's probably from seed from the late 1800s. So the Fuertes that we have today, you know, that tree, that line started well more than 100, maybe 150 years ago. After the Fuerte came the Hass. And at the time the Hass was developed or discovered, it was a seedling from 1926. And at this time, the Fuerte was already the big variety. But it was just one of the first varieties we patented was the Hass, 1935. So people were excited about it. It was a different variety. They noticed things about it that they liked more than the Fuerte. It was a smaller tree. It had a more regular bearing. The fruit wasn't as alternating. The only thing was back then they thought all avocados had to have green fruit. You didn't want a fruit that would turn black when it ripened because they thought that the consumer would see that and the consumer was rotten. So they talk all this stuff about the Hass is so good, it's so nice, but it's too bad, it's black skin fruit, nobody's gonna want it. So times have changed, you know? So what happened actually was in the 1950s, 1960s, when the avocado breeding program moved to UCR from UCLA, Dr. Berg was the breeder, and he asked the industry what they wanted. And they said, we want a green-skinned Hass. So he worked for about 30 years or so, and in 1982, he released the Gwen, which is green-skinned Hass. Unfortunately, in 1982, the Hass was already the dominant market, and everybody wanted a black-skinned fruit. So it's a challenge with breeding when it takes 20 to 30 years to produce something from seed to final product that the market can change on you in that period. So you have to kind of think about it and be flexible. So he didn't give up though. Because in the mid-1980s, he planted out 50,000 or so seedlings in different locations. And from those came on more recent releases. And I'm going to talk about these a little more in depth, but there's the Langhast and the Surprise in the 90s. Then my professor, my boss, took over in the program we organized in 1999. We released Gem and Harvest. And then in 2013, 2000, we started planting more. And so now we have a new sort of round of selections that we are trying to bring to market. And I'm going to talk about one of our new releases that's been just released this year, the Luna, the UCR Luna. I'll get into that a little bit later. But yeah, so that's kind of the timeline our program's dealing with. So in talking about UC varieties, this 1990s release, this is the Surprise. It was exciting at the time. It It was a deflower type, so people thought it could pollinize well. It's a large black-skinned fruit. It doesn't brown that much when you cut it, so the flesh stays like nice and yellow. You don't see it too much, but it sometimes makes its way into farmer markets up in Porterville or that area. But it's a nice tree. It's a large tree. It has a really erratic bearing habit, though. So it's not a good producer for commercial purposes. So that same year, the land mass was released, and that was a much more commercially successful release. You still see these. They're perhaps the second or third most popular commercial planting now after Hass. It's like a large black Hass with a slightly later season. It's got a nice small seed, a lighter flavor. One of the things that we look for in a breeding program is the tree architecture. So the land mass is nice because it's a narrow upright tree. So you can get more per acre or a smaller yard, and you can kind of keep them smaller and easier to harvest. So it was a big improvement in that sense. In 2003, our next sort of release we had, there was the Harvest, and this is a large spreading tree in contrast to the land mass, and it has a large late season fruit, maybe August, September fruit. It never really took off. Just like the Surprise was not as popular as the land mass, the Harvest was not as popular as the Gem, which was released the same year. And the reasons are pretty understandable. The Gem is a smaller tree. It has more regular bearing. The season is earlier. It's closer to a Hass season. And the nice thing about it as well is that smaller tree, it also holds the fruit inside the tree. So you have a nice leaf cover. You don't get sun or wind damage on the fruit. And that's actually something we look for in our varieties as well. So, with all that in mind, the most recent one that we've released this year is the BL516, or the Luna UCR. The nice thing about this is a deflower type, but it ripens black like a Hass. So the idea is that someone can plant this with the Hass and market the fruit to consumers that will understand how it's supposed to look and how it's supposed to eat. It's very similar size to Hass. It's a nice upright tree, much like the land Hass or Gem. And again, it bears its fruit on the inside of the tree, where they're protected from the elements. And so, if you have more questions about that, that's just coming out in the market now. You probably won't see it in the markets as a fruit for a couple of years. But we're excited about it. It is a good variety. So I had some questions about pruning, and I'm kind of going to get into those now. It's tricky. It's like I said about how I feel about pruning. It's as much an art as a science. You have to kind of treat trees differently and different varieties differently. So for example, this is like a typical Hass, like an overgrown Hass. Looks really big and nice and productive from the outside, but if you get up under there, it's a nice place to put a hammock or a bench, but there's nothing going on. All the fruit's out there on the outside. So what you really want is to maximize your leaf canopy to surface area. So you don't want to have this wasted space on the inside. It also makes it more difficult to pick. You need ladders, you need poles. So you do want a smaller tree generally. So this is, like I said, this when I first started working 20-something years ago, you'd see trees like this up in Carpenter Tree or down in Fall Brook. But now they're going much smaller. Now this is in Chile. This is a pretty extreme example. The Chileans are pretty forward-looking when it comes to their agronomic stuff. But this, something like this, is what people are starting to do in California. Perhaps not at this density. This is a little unreasonable, I think, for us with Hass, but they tried it and they had some success. So when we look at our breeding program and the varieties we have, it's exciting for us as well because although we've been focusing on making something like a land Hass or a Luna UCR that's a narrow upright tree, a nice cylinder, we actually have quite a bit of variety in our germplasm, in our collection, where you have trees that you could perhaps grow like that, like a narrow upright cylinder. Or there's people that are beginning to look at ideas like trellising or growing them on pergola, like kiwi fruit. And there are some varieties that might have the right root structure and branching structure for that as well. It's a brand new area, and actually it's kind of exciting because we don't really know where the industry is going to go at this time. But we believe we have different tree types that will fit different options. Another idea for making smaller trees or more manageable trees with rootstocks, and there is some success in that area. We don't have a true dwarfing rootstock for avocado like you do for stone fruits or citrus, but there are avocado varieties in the UC program that generate a smaller tree, a more efficient tree. But we also have scions to do the same thing. So this is an idea. Now, someone asked about how I can prune trees to maximize production. This is an idea that I've seen work on Hass very well. And there's a grower up in Ventura County who does a really good job with cycling their leaders. So you basically, instead of having your tree as a single sort of dense cylinder, you select different cylinders, different branches, and you girdle one, which is where you sort of cut not too deep around the branch to encourage fruit set and flowering above that. And you have maybe 3 of these branches in the tree. You do one each year. And so after you've girdled it and it flowers heavily and fruits heavily, you prune that off the next year and you girdle the next one. So you're kind of rotating through the canopy. And if you do this on a large scale basis, you can really even out your yield. So you can have a sort of more consistent yield instead of the trees fluctuating up and down. Because you're causing them to fluctuate within the canopy instead of across the acre. So this is pretty good. But I don't know that this would work on a smaller variety necessarily. So when you get a variety, you just have to sort of play with it and figure out how to work with it. So I'm going to get a little bit of basics here about irrigation and fertilization. The major NPK, the major stuff, avocado is not as heavy a feeder as citrus is, but it still needs its nitrogen. And zinc is another one you put on as well. Usually wait until after the fruit set flowering for zinc. Foliar applications don't work on avocados. They work with citrus, but don't try them on avocados. So this is the pictures of like what happens, if you have deficiencies. Nitrogen deficiency, generally your leaves are not as dark green. It's just a sort of yellowy color. It's not as vigorous. Phosphorus, you get this kind of burning here, which is different than potassium, where you get that more in between the veins and leaves. And you also have fruit size affected. Zinc, sometimes I've seen this, you use zinc sulfite to fix it. You get a kind of yellowish leaf like that, and a tight rosette in the growth of the branching, and round fruit. Boron, now this is interesting, I never used to see this, but in some situations now, and also in the Central Valley, you'll see this. And it seems like maybe some varieties are more affected than others. The main thing you notice is the fruit gets this weird kind of, almost like a thumbprint or a dent into it. But yeah, so those are your symptoms of nutrient issues. Iron deficiency as well, you get a yellowing. We've had issues with this, with certain rootstocks, when you combine salty water with the calcareous, like the calcium carbonate soil. Some rootstocks are really sensitive to that, and you just have to put iron on. Irrigation, avocados, the roots are very shallow. Most of the roots are in the top 18 inches, so that's where you're irrigating. But they also don't like to sit in water, so you want to let them dry out a little bit in between. The worst thing for an avocado is sitting in soggy soil. So yeah, they're prone to low oxygen stress for that reason. So in California, your pests are not as bad as in some places. The main one we have issues with here is avocado thrips and forseamite. Generally speaking, when people ask me about avocado pests, the recommendation I tell them is to check out UC Davis, the IPM website. They have a really good website that will give you a breakdown. You can either look for a crop species, look for all the avocado issues, or you can look for a specific pest, like a thrip, and it will give you all the thrip types. But I'm not a pest guy, so I just tell people to go to UC Davis IPM. They can give you a lot of information about that. And a lot of them are, you don't need to use a lot of sprays usually for some of them. You know, this year we had a lot of issues with mites and thrips because of the cool winter and spring. But it's not as there are some diseases and issues out there. Fortunately, California's been pretty lucky so far. So this is one that we were really worried about 10 years or so ago. It's a little beetle, and I see it in our fields a lot in Orange County now as well, where it drills in and it leaves these little white sort of sugar volcanoes. It's an interesting system. There's actually a much worse one in Florida called the laurel wilt ambrosia beetle. The one we have here is not nearly so bad, but it's an interesting system from this perspective is that the beetle actually carries a fungus on it and goes into the tree, and then the fungus infects the tree and the beetle eats the fungus. The beetle's not going after the tree, it's going after the fungus, but the fungus is what causes the tree to overreact and shut off its vascular system and suffer this sort of damage. This particular one in California we have right now, it's not as bad as the Florida variety. It's more of a management issue. So we got to keep our fingers crossed that don't get anything worse than we already got. So other diseases in California, I'm going to go over, we'll talk about root rot, sun blotch, and then there's just some branch canker and dieback that is not such an issue in our drier climate as it would be perhaps in Florida. But you have to keep an eye out for different things arising, different issues coming up. There's always something on the horizon that could be worse. In a global economy, there's people and plants and products moving all around, and with them come potential diseases. So it's good to be aware of what's out there. So this is one that we still see in California and globally. It's a virus called sun blotch. It's not super transmissible. It's only transmissible through pollen to a point, and then also graft unions. You see it in the fruit, like it forms like a yellow kind of blotch or indentation, and the leaves can be kind of yellow and curled, and a lot of other things like that. It's not as important because it doesn't spread so easily. The big one in California and the sort of focus of our UCR breeding program for rootstock is the root rot, Phytophthora cinnamomum. And this is one that causes this sort of dieback that you see here. And it was a really big deal when I first started in California working with avocados 20-something years ago. You'd see a lot of areas where the root rot had come in and they would abandon it. They developed some techniques like injecting phosphorus acid, and that helped. But a big part of the UCR rootstock program was breeding varieties that could resist this particular pathogen. And we've been pretty successful in that. There's also a lot of new chemical biocontrols. It's like mulching. I always tell people you should really mulch avocados. I like mulch a lot, helps out, helps them resist these kind of issues. There's also some new chemical treatments. So root rot is fortunately a lot more manageable than it used to be, which is nice. And like I said, there's these different rootstocks. So Brandon is a UCR rootstock that has shown more resistance to this disease. So when people brought avocados up to California, obviously at that time their concern was the cold. That's why they focused on Mexican as well as Highland Guatemalan varieties. So avocado is about as adaptable to cold as lemon. Generally, I tell people if you can grow lemon in your area, you can grow avocado. They can take some freezing, but not a lot. So, you know, this is what happens. You get these vascular issues. You get this sort of red fruit that drops. So that's what happens after a heavy cold. Heat as well. Avocados don't like it too hot. Their sort of ideal temperature is between 50 and 86 Fahrenheit. You get much above 90, the tree kind of shuts down and waits for it to cool off. So one of the ways that people deal with this is you can put in overhead irrigation or something to sort of cool off your rows, or if it's in your backyard, you can just set up a sprinkler if you know it's going to be a hot day. The other thing about hot temperatures, high temperatures, is it's not just the heat, it's the hot and dry. So these Santa Ana conditions we get sometimes, if you know a really hot, dry period is coming on, if you could get water onto your trees, like maybe 2 or 3 days before that, you see they handle it a little better because they have the actual water in the root zone that they can bring up and push out into their leaves to keep the leaves cool and active. So this sort of past, present, future. This is a current current research and current focus. You know, we're big on genetic diversity, and that's why we have large holdings at UC Riverside. We have actually at this point over 300 avocado sessions between our lab and the rootstock lab. We also have a lot of other related species. Some of these pictures here, these are not avocado, but they're avocado relatives, like the area of Daphne, Persea, and up there in the corner, that's an Ocotea patanthera. So these are related species that in some cases are pretty rare and maybe are not present in the places they were collected from in the 1950s and 1960s. So we try to keep these alive as well as if we go out and find new varieties or some backyard varieties, we try to keep these in a collection. So one of the things I've been looking at as well is that every time you clone something, you run into the chance of having a mutation arise. And so Hass has been cloned many times. And so we are starting to see some of these. One of the earliest sort of famous mutant types was the Carmen Hass, or the Carmen Mendez, the Mendez Hass. And that was it was a regular fruit, but the flowering was a little different. It had a tendency to flower more often in the off season than a Hass did. These two new ones that I've been doing my research on are from Chile, actually. They're called the Yucatan and the Flavia. And they were described in the patent as being a larger and earlier Hass. So my goal was kind of to figure out, like, well, are they really earlier or are they really larger? Well, they are larger. We did find that. That's indisputable. So this is a variety. Both of these varieties produce a larger fruit consistently in different environments. But the question remained is like, well, a larger fruit, are they still earlier? And I've noticed with the Flavia that when I picked it, it was better eating quality in the early season, like in November, December, than a Hass in the same location. So we tried to figure out, well, why is that? And the sort of typical metric for avocado is dry weight or dry matter. It's just a percentage of non-water in the fruit. We didn't really find a serious difference there. So I started looking deeper into like oils, like I was talking about. Avocados have this unusual fatty acid profile. If you were to make oils from them, it's very similar to an olive oil. High oleic, a little bit of palmitoleic, and then lower saturated fats. And so we're looking at that, and we didn't really see a lot there yet either. I did find differences in palmitoleic, which is exciting. I don't know if it's enough to really explain the difference, but it's a start. So, you know, the other thing is when you think about avocados, environment is still king. So those mutations we see, they hold over different areas, so you still get a larger fruit, even in a hotter area than Hass. But the environmental effect is still king in a lot of ways. So what you see here is saturated fatty acids. In a hotter climate like Lynn Cove, which is up in the Central Valley, you have more of those. But the trend is roughly the same still, whether in Hass or other varieties, that you start with a higher saturated and polyunsaturated fat, and then you move into the season and you get more and more monounsaturated fats like oleic. So it's a healthier oil, you know. So that's what I found out, and that's why it's taken me so long to finish my research, because I didn't really find what I was looking for. But I found something. So anyway, there's much to consider. You look at the future, you know, like I said, there's always the issue of new pest species arising. We have to keep our eye out for that. Climate change, environment, and land use. You know, like how do avocados adapt to using less water, or using a higher or lower quality water, more salt tolerance, for example. And then also different ideas about production and management. Like I said, we're kind of at a crossroads when it comes to, are we going to trellis them, or are we going to grow them in a traditional field setting? And you know, like the genotyping and stuff, and also you know, the production of rootstocks or other varieties from tissue culture, different clonal systems. These are all kind of new areas that are opening up. And so you need kind of a crystal ball, like my boss always says. You know, you don't want to end up developing a greenskin Hass long after the market is closed for that. With that, I'd like to acknowledge the California Avocado Society, where I got a lot of these pictures from, their old yearbooks, my department, and UCR. And also, you know, we had a lot of volunteers from California Rare Fruit Growers and national gardeners that have looked after our fields and helped us out with a lot of stuff. So I guess with that, I can take any questions. I think it was 45 minutes.
Do you have an accession from the huge avocado tree that's growing in Tucson inside of
Are you talking about the Arabica? We have Arabica. I think that's a variety from the Arabica River down by Tucson.
This was inside the convent, so it was in a courtyard bearing fruit.
I haven't seen the original tree, but we have a variety called Arabica that people brought out from Arizona. It's a Mexican type. I think it's a green skin. It's a fair tasting fruit, but it's supposed to be very resistant to, you know, the Tucson environment, which is it's more extreme than here. Yeah.
So would you consider a habitat as a subtropical rainforest?
So the native habitat of avocado, they call it the neotropics. So, but it ranges from highland to lowland with those three different ecotypes. So yes, I mean, like there's some of the varieties, like there's different varieties in different areas, different types of avocados in different areas. So if you go to Colombia, you'll find varieties like Lorena and others that are a large green-skinned fruit. They're obviously a mix of the West Indian or lowland types with Guatemalan or other ones. Different areas have different avocados. So what I would say is that the ones that are arisen from California, such as Hass, Hass at least, it does not perform as well in some of those tropical areas as the tropical ones from there, because it tends to have issues. In tropical areas, you have a whole different set of problems, mostly with like skin rots and fruit issues. And Hass is more susceptible in those cases than perhaps like a Caribbean variety that might be more adapted to that climate. So the other thing about its sort of origin is that it's traditionally, it would be an under canopy tree, so it would be growing in a forest. So it has a very strong light response, which is challenging in managing it because we grow them in full sun. So you don't necessarily want it to be trying to grow and reach towards light. You just want it to sort of stay as a nice tree, you know. So there are some differences in where we sometimes try to grow it from where it originally was.
Is it true that you cannot get fruit from a seed that you grew yourself? I grew up Pinkerton from seed.
Okay.
It's now 10 feet tall. So I was about to rip it out like a month ago, but I haven't had time.
Okay.
Will it?
So the thing about trees, and that's why I went into that whole thing early on about the grafting system and the clonal system. If you want your fruit to be the same as the fruit that you tried, you have to clone that tree that gave you that fruit. If you plant fruit from that tree, you can get fruit from it. You can get, but it could be very different. It could take you 20 years. It could be like all seed or very necky. It might taste terrible. Like I've actually tasted bad avocados. They're out there. So that's the issue. They can have fruit, but there's a lot of variability. So. Yeah.
taste, what are your three favorite flavor avocado varieties?
Well, taste is part of it. I mean, if you look at what I think of is important in avocado variety, it's actually a lot of it's texture. I don't find the taste to be super strong, but I think that there's sort of like, there's a couple different texture types. So for me, like I like them all in different ways. Like a fuerte, and we have some other early varieties, is kind of creamy and soft. It's actually a low dry weight, so even when it's ready, there's more water, but it doesn't taste watery. It still has that nice mouthfeel. I think it emulsifies well. So there's that kind of creamy type. There's also like a lamb has, which is, I think, a lighter taste, not as strong. Some people don't like it as much for that reason, but its texture is different in that it slices well. I think it holds like as a sliced fruit or a cut fruit. And so for me, even though the flavor is not as strong as say a Hass or a gem, I still like that fruit for what you would use it for in that case. And then, you know, getting into the sort of more typical varieties like Hass, gem, to me, gem it has a texture that's more meaty. It's almost like it has a grain to it. And I think that's part of that textural perception. But by and large, I mean, I like avocados. I really care that they peel well. And so I like an avocado that peels well because I actually like to quarter it and then peel it and then have that. So I look for that a lot too. Like, so there's some varieties that taste really good, like Jan Boyce, but then the peel is kind of flaky and peels off. And it's a little disappointing for that reason. Reed's great. Reed's amazing. You know, that's when people say, "What's your favorite avocado?" It depends on what's in season. But when Reed's in season, it's really hard to beat.
Yeah, can you say something about the dwarf varieties, Holiday and Little Pato? Are those actual dwarfs? Are they on dwarfing rootstocks, or what's the deal?
Okay, dwarf varieties. So there's no true dwarfing rootstock in avocado in the way that there is in other, like stone fruit or citrus, where the definition is that the internode distances are shorter. So the Holiday, I'm more familiar with Holiday, or XX3 as it was called, because we have it in some of our trials. And it's a dwarf variety in the sense that the tree is small, but it's not dwarf because it grows more slowly. It just can't support itself, so it tends to weak and kind of fall back on itself. So that's a different kind of dwarf than, you know, something that is sort of just small but growing upright. Little Pato, like I said, I haven't looked at that as much, so I don't know as much about it. I would say that the Holiday, when we first sort of opened up to the public in 2000 or 99, that was right when I started working. It's different, and I think, from my opinion, it's a climate change issue in Irvine, in the fields there. Like, it used to be that variety, it was called Holiday because the volunteer groups would eat it and felt it was the best tasting fruit during the holiday season now. So from Thanksgiving until Christmas. But I would say in the past 10 years in Irvine, I have not been able to get that fruit to stay on the tree past July or August. And it's not good in July and August. So that's a separate thing from its growth habit, but it just, to me, that's when it comes to ripening fruit, there's sort of two things that happen. Like, it reaches maturity and it stays on the tree. And that one needed to stay on the tree a long time, and it can't anymore in our climate. But in the Central Valley, where everything is faster, it's still a small tree up there. Everything comes off the tree earlier up there, but it reaches maturity earlier. So actually, a Holiday up in the Central Valley, it produces a nice sized fruit, because everything's smaller up there and Holiday's really big. Produces a nice sized fruit, and you can harvest it in March, and it stays in the tree that long. So it might not be a good variety for Irvine or Southern California anymore. but it might be a good variety for up there, although it's a little cold sensitive. So.
Thank you so much for your talk. That was really enjoyable. And your walks are very impressive.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, amazing. I have a couple of questions. I'm curious what brought you to avocados to begin with. And I'm also curious about the female to male situation that you were describing for the blossoms. Do those attract different pollinators? Like the female in the morning, does that attract a different pollinator from the male? Do the bees like both? Do they? I'm just curious about.
There's a lot of, okay, I got into avocados because they were hiring.
Because they were
I needed, well, I mean, I was working at UCR, I started in the ecology lab, and I went in and there was more work upstairs if you wanted. Yeah, I'll take the full 40 hours, and you know, I always like eating avocados. So I got lucky. When it comes to flower, there's a lot of work with pollinators, the insects. And you know, out of New Zealand recently, I think David Pattermore is sort of one of the preeminent people on that. And there's a lot of people that also work in different areas because avocado, honeybees aren't native to the New World. And so we're not necessarily sure what, in Southern California, where they're not from anyway, what would be the ideal pollinator for them. I've been down in Chile, no, it was Peru, and this guy had a chicken farm, a lot of chicken farms down there, and he was using the manure and the feathers and leftover. The soil is very sandy to build up the soil. But then he was also experimenting, and I don't think you'd want to show this to people that were buying the fruit, but he would experiment with running the chicken slop in between the rows, getting the flies to come in. The flies would land on the trees and they would pollinize. We got good fruit set. Sounds disgusting, but it worked.
Well, the pawpaw plant too attracts, it has that foul smell that attracts pollinators to it. So it's
Avocado, yeah, the flowers of avocado. So your question also about attractants. The nectaries are more active during the male phase. So actually you find that bees and other insects are, and when they're in male phase, you actually I'll find ants on them and a lot of other insects. They're more interested in that male phase. So I don't know how the female flowers do it, but yeah, you know, I mean, so getting back to your original question, there's other researchers that talk about wind pollination. The shape of the pollen is not likely to be wind driven. It just doesn't look right. And nonetheless, like growers use bees and they get higher production with bees. And if they were, it doesn't make sense to spend money on something that's not actually working. So I mean, honeybees do work. But yeah, there is a lot of ideas. I mean, that's one of David Pattamore's things too, was looking at night colonizers like moths and other stuff. And he had some, he did some like camera work, you know, and triggered cameras. It's an open area. Yeah.
Good, thank you for
Yeah,
that.
no problem.
Well, I have a question. So last year, Tom's family of Davis Nursery, he came here. If I recall correctly, he said that he cut his avocado tree so it doesn't become a very tall or huge tree.
Mm-hmm.
But during the talk, you said that there was a grower in Ventura County.
Mm-hmm.
His method is like cycling leader.
Yeah.
So are you saying that the tree architecture is more like multi-leader? It doesn't really have a strong central leader. So
Yeah, well, that particular style, and that branch actually it's a subsidiary of Brokaw Nursery, who also top their trees. But there's two different things that we're talking about. We're talking about a small tree you're going to plant out that's going to grow into something that is going to be a tree, you know, that you're going to get fruit off of, and you have that tree that's already there. So I mean, trees keep growing. So that initial topping is going to create a more bushy tree, but you know, you'll get a shoot that just takes off, or another shoot. That just happens. You can keep pruning those back, or in that system, you can treat them as a production, a future fruit producing unit, I guess you'd say. So the way I think about that structure is that you have a sort of base, and you know, that base is always there, and there's fruit in that as well, the canopy, but you have these parts of the canopy that you're cycling. You know, so I think the goal to think about is that you're creating, instead of creating the whole tree having fruit all at once or not having fruit, you're separating part of the canopy out to be different than the rest, so that over an acre it's more even within the trees. So,
How far, if second tree, how close would that be?
for pollination. Well, as a rule of thumb for us, so we have a difficult time hand crossing because of the flowering issues I talked about and the inefficiency. So we tend to think if you keep them a quarter of a mile apart, they won't cross.
Okay.
So less than a quarter of a mile, yeah. If your neighbor has a tree, you're likely getting pollen. It just depends on what's open and the time of day and how the bees feel.
When you girdle the tree, do you go through all the layers and family?
No. You just want to get the phloem. You want it. I'm sure you can find some videos online that have it. Actually, up in Brokaw, where they were showing, they'll cut a little window to make sure they're not going too deep into the xylem, and then they'll just go around like that. You don't want to cut it too deep. It'll recover, but it's unnecessary.